This incident happened to the son of a woman I worked with back when I was in retail. I'll change her first name and patronymic to something similar and call her Maria Ivanovna. The names of everyone else in the story, however, I'll leave as they really were. Maria Ivanovna was the warehouse manager at a food distribution base. Because of my job, I dealt with her quite closely. Sometimes I even had lunch with her there at the warehouse, in a small circle. So I knew about the events I'm describing from the very beginning. She lived alone with her son, who had just come back from the army that spring after serving the full required term. His name was Arkady. He often stopped by his mother's warehouse, mostly after work, to help carry bags home with her. You understand, that comes with the territory when your mother runs a food warehouse. Arkady turned out to be quiet and shy, surprisingly so for someone his age. Getting more than a few words out of him was like pulling teeth. Maybe he felt insecure about his looks. That's not usually something you associate with guys, but maybe that was the case with him. He definitely wasn't handsome. His face had rough, oversized features, like they'd been chopped out with an axe by a slightly drunk carpenter. His build matched it too, a little crooked, long arms, broad bones. He was stiff and awkward, like a badly put together wooden frame. Still, you couldn't call him some hideous Quasimodo. He was just an ordinary, lanky guy who looked a bit like a country boy. His mother was always trying to find him a bride as quickly as possible. With the help of older warehouse women and store managers who came to pick up goods, she kept introducing Arkady to different unmarried gals. But it never went beyond the first meeting. The women in and around that trade world didn't care much for simple, quiet men like him. They liked lively ones, with charm, wit, and swagger. Still, Arkady didn't stay alone for long. Without any help from his mother or her pushy friends, he found his own destiny. And I mean destiny in the literal sense. The feelings that flared up there between them made Romeo and Juliet look tame by comparison. The girl he fell for was named Antonina, or Tonya. I don't remember exactly where they met. She worked in refractory production at the NTMK plant, doing some ordinary working-class job. But she didn't look plain at all. She dressed in fashionable branded clothes, despite how expensive they were back then. She wore a modern haircut, makeup, and looked very put together. After she met Arkady, she even took charge of his appearance. The guy transformed before our eyes. Though honestly, I think it wasn't so much the new wardrobe as the love he felt for her overflowing out of him. Arkady's mother often complained that the two of them were constantly glued to each other, always in a tight embrace with little kisses and all kinds of affection. Arkady especially loved it when his beloved Tonya would gently nibble on his ear. In those moments, he'd squint with pleasure and practically purr like a tomcat in spring. It was almost embarrassing in front of other people. Maybe it was just a mother's jealousy. But I saw them too, and they were always either wrapped around each other or at least holding hands. That was love, all right. They met sometime in the middle of June, about a month after Arkady was discharged from the army. They both worked, and they devoted all their free time to each other. What they especially loved to do was drive off in Arkady's old Zhiguli, the little Soviet Kopeka he'd inherited from his late father, to one special place. From what Maria Ivanovna said, it was an old, abandoned, deep quarry in the middle of the forest, about 2 hours outside the city. She herself had only been there once before Arkady got drafted. The whole family had gone mushroom picking. She said they'd gathered an unbelievable amount of redcaps and porcini. The place was hard to reach, and no one really went there. Getting there was difficult too. first by car until the road turned into total wilderness, and then another 10 kilometers or so through rough forest terrain. But the place itself and the view of the round forest lake with its smooth blue surface framed by pine trees, with shores decorated by strange, beautiful wildflowers, was like something out of a fairy tale. That was where Arkady and Tanya went several times over the summer, whenever they happened to have days off together. Unfortunately, that wasn't often, since they both worked shifts. But after those rare 2-day trips, they both looked like the happiest people in love on earth. They called that little paradise our place. There wasn't really anywhere in the city for them to be together. The girl's parents and Arkady's mother both disapproved of young people living together before marriage. Maybe that was for the best. It tends to push things along toward a wedding. Otherwise, people live together in a civil marriage for a while and then split up for reasons nobody can even explain. We all know stories like that. Before they filed their marriage application, Tanya, without giving much explanation, decided to change her name. She wanted to become Elvira. She said she'd never liked her own name since childhood, but she liked Elvira. Well, Elvira it was. She was an adult and had every right to decide what she wanted to be called. Nobody tried to talk her out of it, especially since she laughed and said that Arkady and Elvira sounded much prettier together. The two of them lived in the same neighborhood, and Arkady always met her at the factory gate when she finished her evening shift, so he could walk her home. That workers' district wasn't the safest place for a girl to be walking alone at night. But one day, for some reason, Arkady couldn't meet Tanya, now Elvira. She finished her shift, walked out of the factory gate, and never made it back to her parents' house. The next morning, her mother and father raised the alarm. Elvira didn't have many girlfriends she might have stayed with, and Arkady, stunned by the disappearance of his bride-to-be, knew nothing either. They went to the police. To their credit, the officers started canvassing the neighborhood that same day, the area along the route Elvira would have taken home. Soon, the search succeeded, but tragically so. Elvira's mutilated body was found in one of the condemned 2-story buildings in the settlement. The people responsible for the girl's brutal murder were identified quickly. The merciless monsters turned out to be a gang of underage degenerates between 10 and 14 years old. After sniffing glue and getting drunk, those little animals dragged the girl into the ruins and tormented her until she died from the torture. I won't describe all the details, although Maria Ivanovna, who might have become her mother-in-law, constantly shared with us what she heard about the investigation. I'll only say this: when the girl was no longer able to stand, they propped her legs up on a cinder block and jumped on them with all their weight, breaking the bones. What can you even say to that? Children are the flowers of life. After hearing the news about Elvira, Arkady went insane with grief. Maria Ivanovna genuinely feared for his life. She was certain he might kill himself. She even took time off work so she could stay beside him and not leave him alone. After Elvira was buried, that very first night Arkady went back to the cemetery and dug up almost the entire grave with his bare hands. Luckily, a group of young people passing by noticed the strange commotion among the gravestones. They barely managed to drag the mud-covered, deranged boy away from the pit, calm him down somehow by pouring half a bottle of vodka down his throat, and get him home to his mother. But every night after that, he still couldn't sleep, and he kept trying to run back to the cemetery, to the grave of the girl he loved. driven half-mad herself with worry for her only son. Maria Ivanovna couldn't think of anything better to do than take him to a local healer. That was where Arkady heard words from the old woman that sank deep into his tormented soul. "You may still have time to hear and see the dead girl, if you hurry," she told him. Or rather, to say goodbye to her suffering soul. "But you shouldn't be looking for your beloved in the graveyard. You should look for her where the two of you were especially happy together while she was alive." And then she added seriously, "And remember, if you find her soul, do not hold on to her. Say goodbye and let her go." The very next morning, Arkady hurriedly threw some basic camping gear into the trunk of his old Kopika and rushed off into the forest to the abandoned quarry that everyone else had forgotten. He left and then vanished. Maria Ivanovna was beside herself. She cried openly right there at work, saying she never should have let her son go into the forest alone in that condition. What if something had happened to him? How could anyone get there to find out? She didn't remember the road herself. It was too twisted and confusing. But 3 days later, the prodigal son returned to his mother, and he had changed dramatically. He was lively, energized, almost glowing with happiness. At first, his mother was frightened. Had he completely lost his mind? But no, Arkady was perfectly coherent. He seemed to have returned to his usual self. The black grief that had twisted him nearly into madness had vanished without a trace. The next morning he went to work in a cheerful mood, as if he hadn't said a final farewell to his first and only love just a few days earlier. When his mother asked him about the trip to the forest, he answered shortly and simply, "Everything's fine, Mum." It was obvious he wasn't telling her everything, but for Maria Ivanovna, even that was enough. Thank God, Arkady had come back to himself and wasn't destroying himself with grief anymore. When the next weekend approached, Arkady got ready to go back to the forest again. "Where are you going, son? Back to the woods again?" "Yeah, Mum. I'm heading to our place. I'll go pick some honey mushrooms. There are tons of them there right now." "But the weather's awful, son. Look, it's pouring rain." "At our place, Mum, the weather is always good. And even if it rains, I'm not afraid of it. Last time I built a nice little shelter on the shore. I won't get wet." And with that, he left. He came back 2 days later, glowing with a smile and in an excellent mood. Only one thing was missing. No mushrooms. "So, where are the mushrooms, Arkasha?" His son laughed merrily and, unable to stop himself, added, "I didn't exactly have time for mushrooms, Mum." But he caught himself right away and said nothing more. That was how the autumn passed. Until the first real snowfall, Arkady kept going back and forth to the forest quarry without missing a single weekend, and sometimes even taking time off work to do it. Only when heavy snow buried all the roads did he reluctantly stay home. In the evenings, he paced around the apartment like a wound-up machine, unable to settle. And one day, he couldn't take it anymore. Despite the cold, the wind, and the snow, he set off into the forest again, driven by some need known only to him. As it later turned out, his car got stuck around 40 kilometers from his destination. After that, the stubborn fool kept going on foot, sinking into soft snow up to his knees, even on skis. But in the darkness and blizzard, he lost his way and never reached the quarry. He was lucky just to make it back somehow to his half-buried little car. Otherwise, he might have ended up lying in one of those deep forest drifts until spring. Still, that trip didn't leave him untouched. Arkady came down with severe double pneumonia. He ended up in intensive care, where doctors managed to save his life. After that, he spent a long time recovering in a hospital bed, pumped full of antibiotics and every other kind of medical chemistry they had. One day, while Arkady was still in the hospital, Maria Ivanovna was going through his things and found his old digital camera, the one he always took with him on his trips into the forest. He loved photographing nature. Meadow flowers, ripe berries, sturdy mushrooms. There was so much in the woods worth capturing. Curious, she started flipping through the photos. Here were some summer shots, then others with yellowing leaves in the background, meaning he must have taken those in autumn. In some of the pictures, Arkady had photographed himself at arm's length, but the angle was strange. In every single one, he stood off to the side, as if he were leaving space for someone else. But there was no one else visible in the frame, only grass, trees, or the lake in the background. One photograph puzzled Maria Ivanovna, and then seriously frightened her. At first, she couldn't understand what had made her stop and take a closer look. But when she finally realized it, a chill ran across her skin. The shot had clearly been taken at arm's length. Arkady was smiling in it, squinting contentedly. Like in the others, he was standing off to the side, rather than in the center. And right in the center of the frame was his ear. His ear was sticking out in an unnatural way, as if some invisible force had tugged on the lobe at the exact moment he took the picture. Maybe he'd injured it somehow. His mother nervously flipped through the other photos, but in those, his ear looked perfectly normal. And she didn't remember him ever walking around with one ear sticking out like that. Unable to come up with any explanation herself, she decided to ask him directly the next morning. She brought the camera with her to the hospital and asked him, point blank, what in the world she was looking at. Arkady didn't keep silent for long. He told his mother everything, openly, like a confession. It seemed he had wanted to share it for a long time and was exhausted from carrying the secret alone. Mum, that's Elvira beside me. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's her soul. Maybe it's something else. But I can see her. I can feel her. And she can feel me too. It started the very first time I came to our place after her funeral. Now I'm just waiting until I can get back on my feet and the snow melts, so I can go back to her there. Maria Ivanovna had no words for her sick son. She had celebrated too early, thinking he'd escaped losing his mind from grief. Apparently, the terrible stress had not passed without consequences. Why had she ever taken Arkady to that healer in the first place? Her poor son really had lost his mind after all. God, what misery. And yet, what about that photograph with the ear? How were you supposed to explain something like that if you didn't believe Arkady's story? After the severe illness and all its complications, Arkady recovered slowly all the way until spring. But the moment the snow melted, despite his mother's tearful pleas and desperate attempts to stop him, he drove back into the forest through the spring mud to meet his beloved. By then, he was no longer hiding his true intentions from his mother. But this time, he came back the very next day, looking darker than a storm cloud. He went straight into his room, said nothing to his mother, collapsed onto the bed, still fully dressed, and fell silent. A little while later, Maria Ivanovna went in to undress him and put him down properly. When she pulled off his shirt, she was horrified. Arkady's back was covered in long cuts and scratches, as if he'd been dragged over broken glass. There were bruises and blood marks on his neck too. She immediately began tending to the wounds. The pain woke him up. When she asked him anxiously what had happened, he told her he had accidentally slipped from the steep edge of the quarry and scratched himself up. That was all he would say. For about 2 weeks after that, he didn't try to go anywhere. He went to work as usual and helped his mother carry groceries home in the evenings. I saw him several times during those days. Arkady had lost a lot of weight. He was stooped and his face had somehow gone dark. I assumed it was from the illness, but Maria Ivanovna said sadly that he had become like that only after his last trip to that cursed place in the forest. He had almost stopped talking entirely. At least he was staying home now. Maybe, she thought, in time he would calm down. But that wasn't how it turned out. One of the first days of June, without warning anyone in advance, Arkady left for the forest while his mother was out. He only left a note saying he'd be back by the end of the weekend. But when the weekend passed, he still didn't return. Nor did he come back a week later. The management at our trading company pulled every string they could to help look for him, but it led nowhere. They only found the quarry itself after about 2 weeks. There on the shore stood a makeshift shelter, along with Arkady's things. But Arkady himself had vanished, as if swallowed by water. They say divers even went down into the quarry, but they never managed to reach the very bottom in the center. The old excavation was just too deep. And so, to this day, Arkady remains officially listed as missing without a trace. My school years fell right into the beginning of the Soviet Union's decline. But despite that, school social life, as my father-in-law liked to say, was absolutely boiling. I was never the kind of person who wanted to be a top achiever or some hyperactive school organizer. But our restless school community kept pushing me into all sorts of headache-inducing roles. One day, I'd be the editor of the wall newspaper because I could draw well. Another time, I'd be made leader of the student group because I got good grades. And then I ended up in the pen pal club because I knew English better than most. And it's that pen pal club that this story is connected to. If memory serves, the club was called Brigantina. We'd meet after classes. And while my friends ran outside with slingshots and chased a battered football around in the fresh air, I, like the last true macho on earth, sat sweating in a stuffy classroom with a few other nerds, flipping through letters from equally studious kids from other socialist countries. There wasn't much I could do about it. The discipline drilled into me since childhood and the proper upbringing I'd had wouldn't even allow me to think about deserting such an important political activity. Of course, I never worked too hard on corresponding with my distant socialist-minded brothers and sisters. I already had enough real friends at school and in all our neighborhood adventures. Unlike two boys from the club, Sashka and Alyoshka, those two genuine nerds were writing to 10 or 20 different kids from East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Cuba, and who knows where else. We hooligan-type boys constantly made fun of them for it. We kept teasing them. And then one beautiful day, just like that, we watched both of them leave with envious eyes on a friendship exchange trip to to visit one of their pen pals. For 2 whole weeks. And not just anywhere, but to Sofia, the capital of sunny Bulgaria. Golden sand, emerald sea. Meanwhile, we were left behind in the harsh Siberian lands with our slingshots and worn-out football. I think that was probably the first time in my life, as a 6th grader, that I seriously started reconsidering my priorities. So, those lucky nerds went off to sunbathe and swim for 2 weeks at the state's expense. They came back tanned, happy, and bursting with impressions. And along with foreign trinkets and chewing gum, they brought back a story that left me with chills for a long time afterward. When Sashka and Alyoshka landed in Sofia, they were properly welcomed by the parents of the Bulgarian boy they'd been corresponding with for about a year. His name started with a ZH, something like Zhivko, or close to it. Zhivko's family lived in their own house, so the dear little guests from the brotherly Russian Soviet Republic were given a large, separate room to stay in. As it happened, their Bulgarian pen pal himself had been taken to the hospital with appendicitis, literally the day before they arrived. But our 2 nerds still had a wonderful time, patiently waiting for their international friend to come home, while being spoiled at the dinner table by his parents and grandmother, who also lived there. At night, like all boys on vacation, they tried to outdo each other by telling scary stories. Stories about the yellow stain, the blue fingernail, and other classic children's horror nonsense. It was in the middle of one of those scary story evenings that Shivko's Bulgarian grandmother quietly knocked on their door, then carefully stepped inside. She, like Shivko's parents, spoke Russian quite well, so communication wasn't a problem at all. "Boys," she said, "I was walking past your room and heard the interesting stories you were telling. Would you like me to tell you a real story instead? One that actually happened?" Alyoshka and Sashka nodded eagerly from their beds. Their own supply of stories had already run dry. The old woman sat down on a little stool between the boys and began her tale. It happened about 8 years ago. There was a very, very beautiful 17-year-old girl living not far from here. Her name was Ivanka. Every boy in her class, and not just her class, but the entire school, and even boys from the neighborhood, dreamed of becoming friends with beautiful Ivanka, or at least walking her home. But Ivanka had already been dating a boy named Kaloyan for a whole year. He was handsome beyond words. At 17, he already wore an impressive moustache and had no shortage of female attention. In other words, it would have been hard to imagine a more perfectly matched couple. Of course, many people secretly envied them out of unrequited love. Especially the girls envied Ivanka, though they tried not to show it. Ivanka was well liked, both at school and in the neighborhood, always surrounded by a flock of girlfriends and loyal admirers. Then, just before the end of their final school year, one of Ivanka's girlfriends decided to throw a little girls' party. Ivanka wasn't particularly fond of that girl, because she knew perfectly well the girl was crazy about her boyfriend. She dreamed day and night of driving a wedge into their perfect relationship. But their dislike never turned into open conflict, and Kaloyan paid no attention at all to the plain little girl, especially compared to Ivanka. So Ivanka had no real fear in continuing to socialize with her jealous, unsuccessful friend. The girl's parents were away until morning, so the girls partied freely. When the homemade wine on the table ran out, the cheerful friends drew lots to decide who would have to go down into the dusty, cold basement to fetch more. no one volunteered. By luck, the unpleasant duty fell to Ivanka, which made it worse, because since childhood she'd been terrified of the dark. Her girlfriends knew about that childish phobia, and that made it even more entertaining for them to send the beauty down into the shadowy basement with its wine cellar and all its little storage rooms and closets. Giggling, they nudged the hesitant girl toward the stone steps leading down. "Don't be afraid, Ivanka. The lights are on everywhere down there. And a beauty like you, even a werewolf wouldn't lay a paw on you. Go on, be brave." Ivanka went down the spiral staircase and reached the wine cellar at the end of the long, winding corridor lit by dim bulbs. And suddenly, all the lights went out. From somewhere far above came the bright sound of laughter. Her cheerful friends had flipped the switch as a joke. If only they had known how that innocent prank would end. Frozen in place by surprise, Ivanka was swallowed by total darkness and sheer terror. At first, she only cried out, unable to move her suddenly lifeless limbs. But in the very next moment, she sprang up like a wounded bird and began stumbling through the black underground corridor, slamming into sharp corners and cold walls. At one point, she ran chest first into a wooden door hidden by the darkness and fell off a step into empty space. As she fell, out of her mind with terror, Ivanka felt something dense and sticky wrap itself around her face and head, like clinging fingers. Then she hit the stone floor hard and lost consciousness. The faint didn't last long. Ivanka opened her eyes, but saw nothing. She was still surrounded by pitch-black darkness, and worse than that, her face felt trapped inside a tight mask. It was hard to breathe. Something like thin cloth or clumps of thick dust was getting into her nose and mouth. Instinctively, she began tearing at whatever was covering her head and face. It ripped with a dry crackle, but refused to come off. Ivanka flailed wildly, unable to free herself. At last, unable to endure the nightmare any longer, she screamed at the top of her lungs. Immediately, a dim light came on overhead, illuminating a small storage workshop, crammed with junk and draped everywhere in thick spider webs and hanging strands of dusty silk. A moment later, she heard hurried footsteps as her girlfriends came rushing down to the basement in a crowd. When they finally led Ivanka out of the half-dark underground space and into daylight, the girls were stunned. The once proud, untouchable beauty, with her dark chestnut waterfall of hair and elegant, airy dress, had become a heartbreaking sight. She was covered in her own blood from cuts and scrapes, her hair tangled, her whole body coated in a thick layer of dust. But the most horrifying thing was her face and head. They were wrapped in a thick layer of sticky spider webs, making her look not like the laughing, rosy young beauty she'd been just 10 minutes earlier, but like some grey-skinned old witch. It took more than an hour, with the help of her sympathetic girlfriends, to remove all the bits of web stuck in her hair and across her face. But the feeling didn't go away. She still felt as if her skin were being pulled tight inside a mask. Over the following days, Ivanka stood for hours under streams of hot and cold water, scrubbed her cheeks, forehead and chin with expensive creams, went to beauty salons, to massage therapists, to cosmetologists. It was all useless. That horrible sensation of spider webs clinging to her face and head remained just as vivid as it had been that cursed evening. More than that, with each passing week, it only grew stronger, slowly spreading over other parts of her body. First her neck, chest and shoulders. Then it moved to her arms and all the way down to her feet. Ivanka felt as though she were wrapped inside a dense, unbreakable cocoon. Doctors, dermatologists, even psychologists couldn't say anything definite. And because they had no diagnosis, they had no way to fight the relentless torment. Then a month or two later, Ivanka began noticing something even worse. Wrinkles. Fast-growing wrinkles that first appeared on her face and then started spreading over her entire body. Already depressed, she stopped smiling altogether. She began avoiding her girlfriends and even her beloved Kaloyan. She skipped graduation, claiming she felt terribly unwell. Before going outside, she started wearing makeup, something she had never needed before, since she'd once been naturally radiant. With each outing, she used more and more of it. But even that stopped working. It could no longer hide the fresh wrinkles appearing on her face. In the end, Ivanka gave up the effort entirely, fell into a deep depression, and stopped leaving the house. Sometimes she would stand behind the curtain and look through a crack in the window, watching the former friend in whose basement that fatal incident had happened, walk arm in arm with handsome Kaloyan, wearing a triumphant look on her face. Ivanka didn't blame the carefree boy. She had slowly pushed him away herself so that he wouldn't have to witness the horrifying transformation of a ripe, blooming apricot into a shriveled, grey, dried fruit. And so the years passed. During that time, Ivanka's parents tried everything imaginable to free their daughter from the bony grip of that cruel and unknown illness. They went to the best doctors in Bulgaria and in other socialist countries. They even travelled as far as medical centres in Moscow. All in vain. Her tests looked fairly normal. Other examinations revealed nothing chronic. And yet, the young woman kept drying out, bending over, and turning grey. Yes, grey. The once thick chestnut hair with its golden sheen had gone grey and thin. No matter what shampoo poor desperate Ivanka washed it with, it hung down in tangled grey strands. At that point, Zhivko's grandmother broke off her story and looked at the two Russian sixth graders. They were sitting on their beds with their knees tucked up to their chins, mouths hanging open. "What's the matter, boys?" the old woman laughed. "Did I scare you?" The boys shook their heads and immediately bombarded her with questions. "So what happened to Ivanka after that?" But the grandmother was already getting up and heading toward the door. "I don't know. Their family moved away from this area, together with their daughter Ivanka. And they never left a forwarding address." With that, she left, gently closing the door behind her and wishing the boys good night. But Sashka and Alyoshka lay awake for a long time after that, unable to settle down, repeating the details of the old woman's gripping story over and over. "What do you think, Lyosha? Was it real, or just some old grandma's tale?" "I don't know, Sanya. Let's wait until Zhivko gets back from the hospital. We'll ask him." A week later, Zhivko was finally discharged after his surgery. He lived up to his name completely, quick, cheerful, smiling broadly, with lively black eyes full of mischief and adventure. So for the remaining week, the boys had the time of their lives, enjoying each other's company and forgetting about everything else in the world. It wasn't until they were already saying goodbye, waiting for their flight to Moscow at the airport, that the Russian boys remembered the grandmother's frightening story and finally asked the Bulgarian friend the question that had been bothering them all along. "Zhivko, your grandmother told us this terrifying story about the girl, the basement, and the spider webs. Did that really happen? Or did she make it all up? The boy immediately stopped smiling and said sadly, "That wasn't my grandmother who told you that story. It was my older sister, Ivanka. Everything she told you really happened. She's only 25 now." Sashka and Alyoshka were so stunned they couldn't fully recover from it all the way until takeoff. When they got back to Novosibirsk, they retold the story to the rest of us in the Pen Pal Club. I remember we even organised an improvised exhibition of drawings inspired by it, and I, as the editor, put together a huge wall newspaper about it on the second floor of the school. And then, about 6 months later, the Bulgarian friend Zhivko himself came to visit Novosibirsk in return. Whether he stayed with Sashka or Alyoshka, I can't remember now. But one thing I never forgot. When he arrived and his Russian friends asked him about Ivanka again, he told them through tears that his sister had recently died of old age. This happened about 15 years ago. Back then, I found my mother an apartment in a newly built 5-story block on the outskirts of Nizhny Tagil. Closer to our garden plot, just the way she wanted. It was only a 3-minute walk from the apartment to the garden, and we had quite a setup there. A little orchard, vegetable beds, chickens, a yard dog. The only thing missing was a cow. The building was still being filled with tenants. Half the residents were former owners of the private houses that had been demolished to make room for the new apartment block. And among the newcomers, only one person had moved into the 5th floor. A young woman with pleasant features. As is usually the case on the outskirts, everybody knew everybody, and any newcomer was bound to be questioned without much ceremony. But this young tenant wasn't very easy to draw into open conversation. The only things people managed to learn were that she wasn't married, had no children. Her name was Inna, and her parents lived in some far-off village. Inna never went visiting, but she didn't avoid the local women when they came to her themselves, under different excuses, asking for salt or wanting to use the phone. Of course, they were curious. They wanted to see how she lived. But she never let anyone past the doorway, which only made people even more curious about her. In that little settlement on the edge of town, she stood out. Against the general background of headscarves and padded jackets, she was noticeable for her neat clothes and well-kept appearance. She didn't wear makeup like most of the women, didn't flirt, and certainly wasn't some chatty, cheerful type. But all the local men began looking her way anyway. I saw her often too, since she lived in the same entrance as my mother, but she didn't make much of an impression on me. Maybe because I'd always worked around women, and had seen plenty of so-called beauties. Or maybe I just hadn't really looked that closely. I had a small grocery store in that settlement. The staff was tiny, and whenever someone was temporarily out, I would come in and cover the shift myself. So I'd worked there as a loader and sat at the register too. One evening I was sitting at the register in the empty sales floor, bored out of my mind. People in villages aren't exactly great lovers of shopping tours. Then Inna walked in. Well, she walked in and that was that. To me, she was just another customer. I waited for her to choose what she wanted and come to the register. She browsed for about 5 minutes, then brought over some small items and a 3-litre jar of pomegranate juice. There was no one else in the store. Nothing was distracting me from work. There was no reason I shouldn't calmly ring up a receipt for a couple of items. But Inna walked up, looked me in the eyes, and I melted. In an instant, it felt as if I had sunk into some sweet dream. I was overcome with such intense sexual arousal that I was stunned myself. I had never felt anything like that in my life, and believe me, I wasn't exactly inexperienced. Yet there I was, sitting in a kind of blissful haze, still ringing up her items, still aware of everything. More or less. Inna left without saying a word, and I sat there, floating in that feeling for another half hour. When I finally came back to my senses, I checked the register and realized she hadn't paid for the pomegranate juice. What an idiot I was. Pomegranate juice was an expensive item for our little store. It wasn't going to ruin us, of course, but the sweet sensation of meeting the girl was slightly spoiled. I was deeply surprised at myself. Because of that hypnosis, or whatever it was, I'd never been suggestible. I'd been present at so many performances by visiting hypnotists back in Soviet times, in the army, in schools, everywhere short of nursery school, and not one of them could put me to sleep or make my hands lock together, which was their favorite little test for suggestibility. Kasparovsky and Chumak on television had no effect on me either, unlike many family members, relatives, and acquaintances. More than that, after reading professional books from my grandfather's library, I had even conducted hypnotic experiments myself on my siblings and friends. And successfully too. I only stopped after I nearly failed to bring one of my younger cousins back out of a trance. That scared me badly. And here some woman just casually, without even saying a word, put me into a trance as she passed by. And what a trance. I practically drowned in her bottomless eyes. Some kind of spell. But 2 days later, she came into the store again, smiling, and handed me the money for the juice. "I forgot to pay you the other day. Here, take it." And she looked at me with a sly little expression. I could tell she seemed to know exactly what I had felt that day. What a witch. Only this time I was talking to her, and there wasn't even the slightest hint of that euphoria. Everything felt perfectly normal, as if I were speaking to any ordinary woman. Then she left. After that incident, I didn't end up working at the register or on the sales floor for a long time. There was no need, so I only saw Inna occasionally when I went to visit my mother. And by then, ugly rumors had already started spreading about her. People said she stole other women's husbands, and that those affairs ended tragically. One man's jealous wife allegedly drove him so mad that he got drunk, locked her in the house, and set it on fire. Then, unable to bear her screams, he ran back into the flames after her and died there too. Another man, in a rage during a fight, beat his wife to death and then immediately shot himself with a hunting rifle. Someone else had supposedly poisoned himself, drowned himself, hanged himself. Those things had really happened. But why blame it all on one woman? People ought to live decently themselves. Besides, Inna never flirted with anyone, not even a hint of it. She had moved in alone and lived alone for a second year. Men did not come to her apartment, that much was certain. My mother wouldn't lie about that. Still, her reputation in the settlement was bad. Probably because of that, the young woman tried not to draw attention to herself too often. She left early in the morning for work in the city centre and came back after dark. One time, an old friend of mine, Vladik, was staying overnight at my mother's apartment. During the day, we'd been building something in the garden, and after the required shashlik and vodka, we went back to the apartment to wash up and sleep. And wouldn't you know it, right there in the entranceway, Vladik ran straight into Inna. face to face. She had gone out late to take the trash. Not only did they bump into each other, they practically collided into an embrace. Normally, they would have laughed and gone their separate ways, but no, Vladik got caught. Soon I noticed he had started coming up with all kinds of excuses to help me in the garden. One day it was finishing the shed, another day replacing the greenhouse roof, then something else, then something else. And every evening he tried to linger around the entrance to the apartment building. Turns out he just wanted another glimpse of Inochka. I told him, "Why are you hovering around like a nervous schoolboy? Go introduce yourself properly." But Vladik was a shy guy, so I had to stand outside with him one day until Ina appeared. When she walked by, we stopped her with some random question, then started chatting. In the end, we got acquainted. The girl turned out to be perfectly pleasant, easy to talk to, without any affectation, and with a good sense of humor. You could tell she missed normal, pleasant human conversation. Once I took a closer look at her myself, I wouldn't have minded starting something romantic under other circumstances. But that was off limits. Wife, kids. Vladik, on the other hand, was single all his life, and he and Nina were clearly around the same age, maybe 25 or so, at least by appearance. So after that meeting, he started seeing the young woman directly, without needing me as a go-between. He completely forgot about helping in the garden too, the ungrateful soul. What garden, when love had burst into bloom like lilacs in May? By the way, every time I met Ina, I noticed a scent around her, something that reminded me of lilacs, very pleasant. But I'd never seen anything like it sold anywhere. I never got around to asking her what kind of exclusive perfume it was. But back to Vladik. He became so close with the young woman that he'd already gone several times to visit her parents in the village. He helped them around the place, brought furniture, even hauled a construction trailer from work for them. Why not let it stand there? There was plenty of room in the garden. At Ina's apartment, he was practically there every day, and he always came with flowers, cake, and little treats. He spoiled his girl however he could, and the things he told me about her were unbelievable. Once, he said, he was walking her home late at night from the other side of the city, from Krasny Kamen, a rough area full of troublemakers, when suddenly a drunken or drugged-up group of 8 or 10 guys approached them. Vladik was a timid man by nature, so I can imagine what he was going through. But Ina calmly took 2 of those punks gently by the arms, led them a little off to the side, whispered something to them, then came back to Vladik, who was standing there frozen like a statue, and simply led him on. The rest of the punks silently stepped aside under her gaze, but what shocked me even more was the way our guard dog Yefimich reacted to Ina the first time he met her. Usually the dog barked furious me at everyone who came to our plot, the moment they appeared on the road a good 50 meters from the house. Even regular guest Vladislav got cursed out in dog language every single time. But when Ina showed up one day, coming by with Vladik on some errand, our Caucasian shepherd Fimka started wagging his tail like some pampered little poodle and fawning all over her, licking her hands. So much for a reliable guard dog. There were other strange incidents connected with this mysterious Ina, but describing all of them would take too long. I'll mention just one important detail. Vladik had chronic epilepsy, second-degree disability status, high blood pressure, and constant headaches. After meeting the young woman, he completely forgot all about his long-time illnesses. A year later, At his regular medical re-evaluation, they downgraded him from second-degree disability to third. Another year later, they removed his disability status altogether. And no, you couldn't explain that away with the healthcare optimization that began about 10 years later, because this all happened 15 years ago, in comparatively better times for poor people on state benefits. So the two lovebirds radiated endless love and happiness. But their relationship never went further than hugging and kissing. Vladek complained to me about it constantly. He was very insecure about it. "Girls just don't love me," he'd say, "but I want to get married, and only to Inna." But Inna remained firm. Softly and tactfully, she always avoided intimacy. How that poor guy lasted a whole year with her like that, I have no idea. I know for a fact that during all that time, he didn't have another woman. And what did that strange girl want from a young man, if not love? If she didn't love him, why bother with him at all? Especially when there were plenty of other men around, more impressive ones too. But that was just it. Those other, more impressive men never got into her apartment. In fact, none of the neighbors had ever once been inside. Vladek alone was one of the privileged few. I asked him once what it was like in there. "Ordinary," he said. "Nothing supernatural. Although once I accidentally saw a white wedding dress in the wardrobe." Maybe she's getting ready for the wedding. I didn't ask. Felt embarrassed. Well, fine. So they continued like that for about a year. You could say almost platonically. Then Inna slowly started distancing herself from him. One excuse after another, always some reason not to meet. Vladek would get turned away again and again, then come down to my mother's place on the first floor, sit there, and complain to her about his unhappy love. But in the end, he stopped going to see his would-be bride. Who can understand women and what's going on in their heads? No point torturing yourself and wasting time. Then about a month later, my mother dropped the news on me. Inna's been buried. I didn't dare tell Vladek right away. Every time I saw him, he kept asking whether I'd seen Inna, whether she was walking around with some man, how she looked, what she was doing. I only told him the tragic news a few days later, when I could no longer dodge his direct questions. It was painful to look at him. I don't remember ever seeing a person's face change so fast. He went dark all over, right in front of me. And then he broke down crying. He had clearly fallen for that Inna very deeply, though he had always been overly sentimental. The next weekend we went to visit her grave. The cemetery was also right there on the outskirts, not far away, half an hour on foot. I cut gladioluses and asters in the garden. It was the end of August, and Vladek bought an enormous bouquet of red roses. We went there in the morning. The caretaker told us where to go. He knew all the dead by name, old ones and new ones alike. We came up to a fresh mound of earth with a wooden cross. Inna's familiar face smiled at us from the black and white oval photo. Vladek burst into tears, and I looked at the birth and death dates, and slowly felt my jaw dropping. February 29th, 1944 to August 13th, 2002. What did that mean? Inna had been 58 years old? I showed Vladek. He was in shock too. Impossible. She had looked 30 at the very most, and even that would have been a stretch. We figured the funeral service must have made some mistake. Anyway, we sat there, drank a little in remembrance, and when we turned to leave, both of us suddenly caught a familiar scent in the air. That same fragrance, something like lilac, like a greeting carried on the wind from May itself. Vladek, do you smell that? Yeah, that's Ina's perfume. The next day, Vladek talked me into driving him to visit Ina's parents in their village. He'd never had a car. We loaded up a mountain of gifts and set off. It wasn't a short drive, but about 3 hours later we got there. He remembered the road well, even though the place was in the middle of nowhere. We stopped at an old but still sturdy house. In the garden stood the construction trailer he'd brought them, so we knew it was the right place. We knocked. 2 old people came out, very old, practically ancient. They invited us in, served us tea with oregano and homemade cookies, and when we asked the question that had been tormenting us about the age of the deceased Ina, they confirmed everything completely. It was no mistake. Their Inichka had indeed been born in 1944, after old Ivan was demobilized from the front because of an injury and returned to his native village, to his Lyubasha. They had now lived together there for 59 years. Her unusual name, strange for our parts, had been his idea too. He'd heard it somewhere during the war, said it was beautiful,